Hello again, and welcome to this latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips to develop your understanding and practice of public speaking. In an earlier video lesson in this series, we started looking at persuasive speaking from a fundamental level by looking at how persuasion is defined, understanding how different approaches to persuasion can be taken given the prior disposition of our audiences, and finally, we looked at how different sorts of persuasive claims lead to different sorts of argument strategies and organizational patterns for your speech. In this lesson, we're going to take a deeper look at how audiences are influenced by communicative lessons based on over half a century of social scientific theory and research in persuasion. In particular, we're going to look at three theories that can help us understand how persuasion operates, theories that you can leverage in your construction and presentation of public speeches. The first is the Elaboration Likelihood Model, or ELM, a theory that examines how persuasion takes place in an audience member based on one of two important routes. Secondly, we'll look at social judgment theory, a theory that looks at persuasion based on the relationship between audience predispositions and the message being provided by a persuader. And finally, we'll look at Maslow's Hierarchy of Motivational Needs, which looks at how human needs and desires can be leveraged as a basis for persuasive appeals. But before we do that, let's take a brief moment to review a basic definition of persuasion. Communication scholar Herbert Simons defines persuasion as human communication that is designed to influence others by modifying their beliefs, values, or attitudes. We talked about this in a previous video lesson as a psychological process, where essentially what the persuader is trying to do is to influence a psychological position that an audience member takes, a valence or a preference, essentially a personal evaluation regarding how positively or negatively they feel toward a particular object. What the persuader is trying to do is to somehow move the audience from the position they currently exist in to a different position, one that the persuader wants to promote in order to achieve a particular goal. So the concept of persuasion has been one that has been studied by social scientists for decades, not just in communication studies, but especially in the field of social psychology, as well as other related social sciences. One of the most important and comprehensive theories for understanding how persuasion works is the Elaboration Likelihood Model, or the ELM, that was forwarded by Petty and Cacioppo in 1986. The ELM posits that elaboration is a mental process that involves actively processing a speaker's argument. What some audience members do when they consume a communication message is to think about it carefully and deeply and examine it based on the things they already know and believe. So, according to this theory, there are two possible routes of audience persuasion. What Petty and Cacioppo essentially mean by routes of persuasion are two possible pathways that move the audience from where they start to where they ultimately finish as a result of the communicator's influence. Those routes include the central route, which involves a high level of elaboration, and the peripheral route, which involves a low level of elaboration. For a bit more detail on this theory, let's take a brief break to look at a video produced by Michael Britt, a psychologist and social media consultant.
The Elaboration Likelihood Model sounds complicated, but let's break it down. You know that to elaborate on something means to take the time to really think about it. If you have to buy a new car, for example, you'll probably give a lot of thought to which car is best for you. You'll read information, listen to people, watch commercials. Putting information together like this and really thinking about it is elaborating. Now, we don't always do this much work. How likely are we to do all this thinking? That's what the Elaboration Likelihood Model is about. How likely are you to elaborate, to think hard about what you read, see, and hear? If you're the kind of person who does a lot of thinking about all this information, then you're using what this model calls central root processing. You're really paying attention to the central details. However, some people make decisions based on peripheral root processing. They don't read much at all about cars. They buy one that looks nice or one that a friend already owns. People like this are paying attention to peripheral information, information that's not really central to what the product's all about. And even people who typically use central root processing might sometimes use peripheral roots. We can all be influenced by what attractive people or smart people tell us, and we sometimes make decisions without thinking about them. So elaboration likelihood. How likely are you to use central root processing, really thinking hard about something, or peripheral route processing, allowing yourself to be influenced by things that really aren't that important.
Okay, so let's reinforce some of the most important ideas from Dr. Britt's video on the ELM theory. What some audience members do with a message is what's referred to as central route processing. In other words, they reflect on the message. They consider it in light of pre-existing ideas on the issue. If an audience is particularly engaged or motivated to focus on a particular issue because it's something that's very relevant to them, it's something that they have experience in, it's something that they have a high interest level with, then they're going to focus more particularly on the content of the message. Now, what this means for you is that if you're speaking to an audience who has a high level of elaboration and is likely to engage in central route processing on your topic, the audience is going to be persuaded by strong arguments. If your content presents compelling evidence and reasoning that leads to strong, well-defended claims, your audience is going to see that as positive. So, central route persuasion is important to think about for two key reasons. First of all, persuasion through the central route is more stable and enduring. If someone has been convinced due to the force of the greater argument, that's going to be an attitude shift that's going to stick with them. Central route persuasion is also more likely to lead to action. If an audience, especially one that has a positive predisposition, is convinced to bolster or strengthen their commitment based on central route persuasion, it's more likely to lead them from just believing you on the level of attitude to actually engaging in some behavior, essentially to act on their positive attitude. Now, on the other hand, when we're talking about peripheral route processing, we're talking about folks that are more easily influenced by cues that are tangential to the message's content. In other words, they're brought to the point where you want them at the end point of persuasion, not because of the strength of your argument, but because of other aspects of the presentation or the communication moment that aren't really as relevant or important. These are what are referred to by scholars who would look at this theory as heuristic cues. What's meant by a heuristic cue is essentially something that helps someone take a shortcut in cognition and judgment. So they're likely to take that shortcut because they don't want to put forth the time and effort to really mull over the specifics of your argument. Largely because they're not interested in it, maybe they don't really have a lot of background in it, they don't see it as having a connection to their personal life. So they're more willing to be persuaded by other sorts of things. For instance, the likability or the attractiveness of the message source. This is the kind of thing that we see a lot, for instance, in commercial advertisements that are selling consumer products. Also, the style and delivery of the presentation. If a public speech, for instance, is delivered in a way that is very charismatic and clear and using a good sense of humor or building emotional and dramatic shifts throughout the presentation, that's something that a lot of people are going to find pleasurable and entertaining and might be more persuaded on that basis, regardless of what the actual content of the message is. Now, peripheral route persuasion can be problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that peripheral route persuasion is more likely to fade more quickly. In other words, you may get some short-term attitude shift, but in the longer run, it's really not going to stick with them. And also, peripheral route persuasion, depending on how it's handled by the speaker or whoever the message source might be, is at risk of being unethical. If you spend more time and effort trying to sway your audience on the basis of things like likability or attractiveness or just how emotionally moved an audience might be, that actually could distract them from the substance of your argument, that can allow the speaker to get away with some things that we wouldn't really want to have in an ethical communicator. Now, of course, on the other hand, if a persuader is using peripheral route persuasion ethically and responsibly, there can be a significant upside. There's the possibility that you could bring an audience closer to the issue. If they didn't really care about this issue up front, or this was something that they didn't really see as something that was relevant to their personal life, and you're able to use peripheral route persuasion as a way to get them attracted and interested in you or interested in what your message is doing in terms of its packaging, you could then get them to be more apt, more likely to listen to additional messages that you might have about this subject in the future. And it could then eventually lead them to the water hole, if you will, and allow them to drink in the substance through central route processing. It could be a way, in other words, to expand your audience of interested listeners. Now, in order to see how this process of elaboration likelihood might influence folks in different ways, let's take a look at what, at the time of this recording, is a contemporary presidential campaign advertisement by the Donald Trump campaign. Take a look at this ad, and we can talk about how different types of audiences might interpret and be persuaded by this advertisement differently, depending on whether or not they're using central route or peripheral route processing.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
The politicians can pretend it's something else, but Donald Trump calls it radical Islamic terrorism. That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on. He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil. And he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
We will make America great again.
Okay, so how might two different types of audience members process and make sense of this advertisement based on whether or not they're using central route or peripheral route processing? So a central route processor, somebody with high elaboration likelihood in this area, would be someone who pays close attention to things like politics and public policy, the presidential campaign, and the various positions and arguments made by different candidates. So this person is going to be looking really closely at the message and thinking about it based on the other information and beliefs and knowledge that they have about these issues. So this processor is going to look at the claims that are being made about policy issues in this ad. The ad focuses on Islamic terrorism and illegal immigration primarily. And so any information or past knowledge that the audience member has is going to be used to essentially check what this person already knows or believes against then what the Donald Trump campaign is presenting on these issues. This processor is also going to really pay close attention to the evidence and reasoning that's used in the argument presented by this ad in order to ground those claims. So a central route processor, for instance, might have some difficulty being persuaded by this ad. The ad makes some really broad claims about the relationship between Muslims and terrorism, and therefore the reason why we need to engage in a temporary ban on Muslims entering the United States. There is a claim that's made about Mexico paying for a wall to keep illegal immigrants out, but there's absolutely no evidence or explanation as to how Mexico would pay for that wall, why they would pay for the wall, why a wall is even necessary. So someone who is looking for strong elements of argument is not going to find a lot they're going to like about this ad. Now, again, just to be clear, this is not an analysis of the ad that's based on any political slant or bias. It's just based on how would someone who's looking carefully at the structure and content of argument process this message. There's not a lot to like in this ad. And so when the central processor takes the guts of this ad in terms of its argument and examines it in terms of their prior knowledge and beliefs on these issues, as well as on the campaigns that are being run in general, then this person might be persuaded by this ad only to the extent that the positions that are being presented by the Trump campaign are positions that this audience member already holds. So if the audience member is predisposed based on their own political interests and knowledge to agree with the things that Trump is saying, they might find this ad somewhat persuasive. However, if this is somebody who is neutral or potentially negatively predisposed to the Trump campaign, they're just not going to be persuaded by this argument because there's no real substance to the argument. It makes a lot of claims and doesn't back any of them up. Now, by contrast, someone who isn't really in the position of engaging in a strong elaboration likelihood, someone who doesn't have big ego involvement when it comes to interest and knowledge in politics and or the presidential race or the public policy issues involved, they're going to be more likely to take the peripheral route. So how are they going to process this message? Well, what they might be attracted to are elements such as the music that's being used in the ad. There's moments where there's very ominous music that's being played, as opposed to other moments in the ad where the music is very bright and strong and optimistic sounding. There's varying uses of visual stimulation in the advertisement. There are some things that, of course, are depicting elements or persons or ideas that the Trump campaign is casting negatively. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, Muslim terrorists, illegal immigrants from Mexico, that are depicted with black and white, grainy, and distorted video footage that also, incidentally, happens to go right along with the ominous music being played. By contrast, when Donald Trump is on screen, the visuals are in vivid, bright color, and this is also where we have the bright, strong, optimistic music. There's very simple connections that are being made when the images are placed on screen at the same time as the words on policy. So when there is text on the screen about the need to temporarily keep Muslims out of the country until we find out what's going on, we see the picture shift from folks in an airport to pictures of very disturbing looking terrorists. So a connection is being made visually between disturbing looking terrorists and the word Muslims. When there's discussion on whether or not Mexico is going to pay for this wall that's going to keep illegal immigrants out, we see pictures of a whole swarm of folks that ostensibly are undocumented folks from Mexico trying to get into the United States. We don't know whether or not that's actually the case, but what we do see is this juxtaposition of words about keeping illegal immigrants out with these pictures of lots of folks just swarming towards what looks like a wall. Very simple connections that don't really have any kind of logical relationship, but the peripheral processor really isn't going to be digging into those logical relationships. And then, of course, there's lots of use of language that folks like Kenneth Burke or Richard Weaver, rhetorical theorists, would refer to as God and devil terms. So words like radical and terrorism and illegal, really, we have an inherently negative reaction to those kinds of words, as opposed to when Trump says we're going to make America great again. Words like America and great, we just have an intrinsic positive reaction to. Well, we'll have an intrinsic positive reaction to that if we are Americans and we identify in a patriotic way with Americans. Of course, if we're not an American citizen, that's not necessarily going to be something that's going to move us. So what you see in these combinations of music and visuals and the use of trigger words in the language is going to be things that are going to emotionally stimulate the viewer. Now, the central route processor isn't interested in that stuff. They're interested in the substance of the argument, the evidence and reasoning used to back up claims. And so these kinds of things aren't necessarily going to be a big influence. But for folks who are not elaborating, folks that are taking the mental shortcuts of heuristic cues, the emotional and sensory triggers of music and visual color and emotional evocative language, that's going to make a bigger difference for these folks. The second theory we should discuss is the social judgment theory that was developed by Hovland and Sherif through the second half of the 20th century. The social judgment theory essentially focuses on the following important point about persuasion. Persuasion depends on the audience's prior disposition on the issues. And this is something that we've talked about in earlier videos in the series on public speaking. We always want to know what the audience is thinking and what their essential attitudes and feelings are regarding the kinds of things that we want to talk about. So is the audience sympathetic? In other words, positively predisposed to our position? Are they neutral? Are they not committed to our position yet? Are they a hostile audience? In other words, are they negatively predisposed to the position that we're providing? So what this theory then gets at is the notion that each person that might be a member of your audience relative to the subject matter and the arguments that you're going to make are going to have three latitudes. In other words, three ranges of possible positions that one might take on the issues that you're discussing. A latitude of acceptance, which is the range of positions that they would be willing to be persuaded by. A latitude of non-commitment, positions that they really don't have a strong opinion on one way or the other. And a latitude of rejection, those possible positions that are outside the realm of positions that they could really see themselves reasonably taking. Let's take a look at this neat video produced by a student in a communication class that describes this theory in a pretty accessible way.
It's a Wednesday night. You've already had a tough week and you really need to treat yourself. So you want to order pizza. You can't eat the whole pizza by yourself. Well, you don't want to let yourself eat the whole pizza. So you try to get your roommate, who is always down to eat, on board. She says, "Oh no, I can't order pizza. I'm too poor." Now you're stuck. But let me introduce to you this little gem that will help you persuade in any situation, even the most important ones, like getting your roommate to order pizza with you. It's called the social judgment theory. Before you can use it on your roommate, there are a few things that you'll need to understand. Imagine the scale in your mind. You have your latitude of acceptance, the range of ideas someone is willing to consider. Within this latitude lies their anchor, where they currently stand. You have your latitude of rejection, the range of ideas someone sees as unreasonable, and your latitude of non-commitment, the range of ideas a person sees as neither acceptable nor unreasonable. To help you out, that scale looks a little like this: latitude of acceptance with the anchor, latitude of rejection, and latitude of non-commitment. When you receive a message, you judge where the incoming message falls on your scale. You choose to reject or accept a message based on your ego involvement and which latitude the incoming message falls in. Once we judge where the message falls, we will then shift our anchor. So here's the secret to all of this. To persuade people, send a message that falls on the edge of their acceptance zone. Hit them in the latitude of non-commitment. If you get a little too crazy and send a message that falls deep in the receiver's rejection zone, it will have a reverse effect and push them further away from what you want them to do or believe. This is called the boomerang effect. So, you want your roommate to order that pizza with you? Well, she said that she was too poor to order pizza. So mention that you have a coupon for a small pizza for $2.99, and if you pick it up, you won't even have to pay the delivery fee. This message falls right in her non-commitment zone. It will persuade her to move her anchor, expand her latitude of acceptance, and throw in on the pizza. Social judgment theory just got you pizza.
So as the video suggests, social judgment theory tells us that knowing your audience's prior disposition with regard to your topic can really help you target your message and get the kind of persuasion you're looking for. So, for instance, let's presume you've got a neutral audience, an audience that potentially has a broader range of a latitude of acceptance and particularly a broad range of a latitude of non-commitment. So a neutral audience that really doesn't have skin in the game yet, really doesn't have a committed attitude one way or the other, can be open to a range of positions. So let's say, for instance, we want to address the need to have more public awareness and especially public education on the important issue of climate change and the global warming crisis. And we're delivering a message to the Pleasant Valley PTA, a group of parents and educators that have a potentially diverse community constituency, and we can probably guess on balance based on the available public opinion data that most of them probably believe that climate change and global warming is a thing, but they're really not all that personally committed or involved in the issue, and so they're relatively non-committal when it comes to public action with regard to climate change. So I might be able to address this group with a speech with a thesis like this: we need to consider how human contributions to global warming will affect our children. So what this does is it takes their potential non-commitment zone with regard to issues of global warming and brings it closer to their latitude of acceptance with regard to one area that we know that they are very engaged and involved in, and that is the health, education, and well-being of kids. So this particular thesis and the arguments that go along with it might push their latitude of acceptance into their latitude of non-commitment zone and get these folks to actually think about global warming is something that affects our kids, so really maybe we need to do something about it in order to help our kids' future. Now, By contrast, let's assume we have a hostile audience. An audience that's negatively predisposed to our position is going to have a bigger latitude of rejection. And the latitude of acceptance with regard to the position we want them to have is going to be pretty far away. So if we shoot too far, if we try to get them to accept a position that they are just really far from being able to accept, we might get that boomerang effect. And the message might actually backfire on us, and they could get more entrenched in their current position. We don't want to do that. So we may need to modify our persuasive goal to something that's a bit more modest. So for instance, let's say we want to take the same general topic of global warming and climate change and deliver a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, an organization that focuses primarily on the interests of business and an organization whose membership tends to be more Republican and more conservative in terms of a political and ideological affiliation. And these groups traditionally are negatively predisposed to active public engagement and public policy efforts with regard to global warming and climate change. So we're not going to be able to get them to do a 180-degree turn and agree with us that we need public action on this issue right away. That's going to be something that's just going to invite the boomerang effect. So instead, maybe we give them a speech with a thesis like this: the potentially harmful effects of global warming on business demand our attention. What's interesting about this thesis is that it is designed not necessarily to move them to public action, because we're not going to get them there. What we want them to do is open their minds to more messages on this point of view that they disagree with, to get them to think about, well, maybe I need to consider these ideas a little more carefully. And so by bringing the message into something that we know these folks care about, business and what's good for business, since they're all business owners and that's something that's very important to them, what we're doing then is potentially expanding their latitude of non-commitment so that, okay, maybe I should at least open myself up to listen to this. I'm not going to take the position of the speaker necessarily, but maybe I need to find out a little bit more, because I am concerned about business, and if there's something to this climate change stuff that could hurt my business, this is something I need to think about. So modifying the goal is still going to be successful persuasion for this hostile audience. You just can't get them as far as you could, say, if they were a sympathetic audience. So by final contrast, if you have a sympathetic audience, an audience that is positively predisposed to your position is already within their latitude of acceptance. So you're not going to have to work very hard to construct an elaborate, complex argument to get them to agree with your position. They already agree with your position. So what you need to do is see what you can ask of these folks that might push their latitude of acceptance even further. So if they agree with you on principle, maybe you're able to push them to behavioral action. So for instance, if we are addressing the Mizzou Environmental Science Club, they already are going to agree with me that global warming and climate change are really important. So maybe I'm going to want to focus my message on getting them to do something about it. Say, to start a 350.org local organization. 350.org, you may recall from a previous video in this series, is an international coalition of social movement and public awareness organizations that are devoted to getting public policy action on climate change. So since I know that these folks already agree with me in principle, I can use the position that they already embrace and potentially push them into a deeper spot in their latitude of acceptance, out to the point where, okay, this is not just something I agree with this really strongly, and I need to do something about it. We, as a group, need to do something about it. Okay, so that's a social judgment theory, and it looks at this notion of how the audience predisposition to your subject matter has a big influence on what you can get that audience to reasonably accept. The final theory that we need to talk about is Maslow's hierarchy of motivational needs. This theory focuses on an area of social psychology that is crucial for persuasive communication, and that's the notion that persuasion depends on connecting to the audience's needs. What this theory focuses on is the reality that all of us as human beings share some pretty important needs, and those needs are vital to not just our survival, but our subsequent growth and development as human beings. So Maslow, as he develops his theory in the middle part of the 20th century, discusses this as a motivational hierarchy. We have broad sets of similar needs that can be impacted in many situations. Some of these needs are more basic than others, and if we don't have those needs fulfilled, we can't aspire to anything else. At the same time, once we achieve those basic needs, we're motivated to aspire to higher order growth and development needs. We want to ultimately the best kind of people we can be. For some clarification on this point, let's take a look at this brief video from a clinical psychologist that explains Maslow's theory in more detail.
Hi, I'm Holly Hancock, here today with About.com to give you an overview of Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. You're probably wondering, who's Abraham Maslow? Well, Maslow was a researcher and a pioneer in the field of psychology in the 50s who was seeking to synthesize a large amount of information about research related to human motivation. Ultimately, the fruits of his research were that he presented a hierarchy of needs categorized by two groups: deficiency needs and growth needs. The important thing about the hierarchy is that it's built on a foundation of basic needs that must be met and satisfied before higher levels of the needs are met. So, let's take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the bottom of the pyramid for Maslow's hierarchy of needs are our physiological needs, those needs that are required for us to sustain life. Breathing, sleep, water, food, and even sex are important for us because we want to perpetuate the species. The next step up on the pyramid are safety needs. Needs are met when individuals feel safe and secure with no threat of physical or emotional harm. Those areas and safety concerns are going to be living in a safe area, medical insurance, job security, financial reserves. Difficult, I know, in this economy, but those things that are essential for us to survive. In the middle of Maslow's pyramid, we begin to see our emotional needs of love and belonging. Once a person has satisfied the physiological needs like sleep and breathing, and safety, living in a safe area and knowing that you are secure from threat or harm of danger, higher needs become more important. Our need for friends, our sense of belonging, and our ability to give and receive love. These are all emotional needs that need to be met as we continue through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Next, it becomes important as autonomous human beings to experience a sense of esteem, to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel like we're important, that we matter. Those things that make us feel important and that we do matter on this earth are self-respect, achievement, attention, recognition, and our reputation. Finally, the apex of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. Self-actualization has been defined by self-help gurus and psychologists the world over. According to Maslow, self-actualization is the quest of reaching your full potential and being connected with the world. Some of those traits of being connected with the world and reaching self-actualization include truth, wisdom, justice, morality, and a lack of prejudice. Keep in mind, though, as you think about self-actualization, it's not an endpoint, it's not a destination, it's a journey, it's something we as humans are constantly trying to achieve. Finally, the benefits of understanding Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Well, if you are in a social and behavioral science field, a psychologist, a counselor, a social worker, it's important to know where your clients are on the pyramid. You must understand where your patients are before you are able to address, assess, or even work with psychological issues. It doesn't make a lot of sense to delve into a patient's negative childhood experiences when they're struggling to keep a roof over their head and maintain steady employment. Understanding Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a critical building block to understand other theories related to human growth and development. Thanks for watching. I'm Holly Hancock, here with About.com. For more information, visit us online.
So as you can see, one of the great byproducts of Maslow's theory is that it provides a treasure trove of specific needs, desires, drives, values, and other motivational factors that persuasive speakers can focus on in order to draw our audience closer in a direct and personal way between the things that they want for themselves and the specific things that we're targeting with our persuasive message. So the key for persuasive speakers in using Maslow's hierarchy as a persuasive speaking tool are twofold. First of all, we need to consider what needs does the subject of my persuasive message address. In other words, if I've got something I want to convince my audience to accept, how will accepting this position, these thoughts, beliefs, or values, or engaging in the kind of action that I'm asking of them, how does it meet some specific needs that my audience has at some place on the hierarchy? Now, at the same time, I also have to consider, where are my audience members currently at on the hierarchy relative to this subject? So this is going to be important for us, especially since we want to make sure that we're not keying in on the wrong places on this hierarchy, focusing on specific sorts of needs or values or desires when they're actually at a very different kind of place. And so there may be a disconnect between where my audience currently is relative to this subject matter and where I'm anticipating that they are. Let's make this idea a bit more clear with an example. Let's say, for instance, I'm speaking to an audience of college students, and the potential thesis that I want to present is going to be on this persuasive message. You should volunteer your time for a political campaign this year. As you may know, there's lots of college students that get involved in political campaigns and political parties during an election year. It can be a great opportunity, especially for folks who are interested in politics and government and some such things. Now, the thing is, though, not everybody in this audience of college students, in fact, perhaps most of the audience, won't necessarily see a direct and personal connection between what's going on in political campaigns and what they're doing in their day-to-day. So we can use Maslow's hierarchy to see if we can get at some of those things that will motivate the students to want to get involved because they see it as something that will fulfill needs that they have. The first thing I need to consider, what needs does the subject of my persuasive message address? Now, depending on what I know about my audience and the things that they currently need, the things that are important to them, I might be able to make these kinds of specific connections to how campaigning for the right political candidate can be a way to address the needs that you have. For instance, if in times of what some might see as a troubling economy, folks have basic physiological and security needs with regard to things like, do I have a place to live? Do I have the resources that I need in order to pay my bills and to feed myself and to make sure that I've got some kind of future of economic security once I graduate college, for instance? If I'm able to connect, well, there may be candidates that are addressing public policy issue areas that you should be very interested in. For example, doing something about the massive student loan debt crisis that's causing economic hardships for thousands of college students across the country. If my audience recognizes, hey, wait a second, this is something that may have an impact on my economic security, maybe I want to do something about that. Now, of course, depending on the nature of your audience, you may have folks that are in a different sort of position. Maybe they're a bit higher up on the developmental needs of the hierarchy, and they're especially interested in things like the sense of belonging from group affiliation, feeling good about themselves and have other people feeling good about the contributions that they're making, and maybe even starting to inch up into areas of self-actualization, such as the need to pursue one's responsibilities as an effective citizen and an interested person in public issues. So for these folks in my audience, I can key in on such points as the relationship between getting actively involved in a political campaign and taking an important stand in your government, in making connections and networking with other kinds of people who are also passionate about political issues and areas. The way that you can feel good about yourself and that other people will feel good about you because you're actually working to make a difference in a way that can be important to the community. So, depending on the needs that you perceive in your audience, you can take what you're talking about persuasively and make these kinds of direct connections. Now, at the same time, we can't forget, we also have to think about the second point. Where are my audience members at on the hierarchy relative to this subject? So for instance, if I know that my audience has particular concerns with regard to economic security, well, that tells me on the one hand that I can make the links between working for a campaign and being able to address those issues in public policy. But the other side of that coin is there's maybe lots of folks in my audience that because of their economic security concerns, they don't have a whole lot of time to be able to devote volunteer hours to a political campaign because they're working a job or two in order to pay for school and to pay for their bills. So I might not want to focus, for instance, on some of these higher order needs for esteem and self-actualization if my audience is primarily concerned with a more basic problem. Hey, I'd love to be involved in politics, but I need to figure out how to pay my tuition bill and to pay for my housing and food. So if this is where your audience is at, then you need to rethink your persuasive goal and rethink your persuasive strategies in order to actually get your audience where they actually are, as opposed to where you think you might want them to be instead. Okay, so what we've got here between these three primary theories, the Elaboration Likelihood Model, the Social Judgment Theory, and Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, are three important sets of ideas that any persuasive speaker can deploy in order to more successfully influence their audience. The Elaboration Likelihood Model reminds us that audiences get from point A to point B in persuasion through two important routes. If my audience is likely to elaborate highly on an issue because they are personally engaged and involved and committed in these ideas, then they're going to be engaged in the central route processing of thinking carefully about the argument that you're presenting. On the other hand, if audiences are not necessarily committed or interested into thinking hard and exerting mental effort on this issue, they're going to be more apt to focus on peripheral cues, such as the attractiveness and likability of the speaker or the skill of the presentation. The social judgment theory reminds us that we need to think about persuasive goals in terms of our audience's predispositions. What positions are they likely before the speech to accept? What are they likely to reject? And what is that area of non-commitment that might give you enough wiggle room to move them in the direction where you want them to be in terms of their attitude? And finally, Maslow's hierarchy focuses on the important emphasis to connect the persuasive goal that you have to the important motivational needs of the audience. You want your audience to be more likely to accept your position because accepting your position is going to help them accomplish what they need to meet their basic needs and to grow and develop as a person. Okay, this is a lot of theoretical and practical stuff to chew on. So if you've got any questions or concerns about the finer details of these theories, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.